Welcome to session 5 on a specifically selected topic, safety of journalists. We are a continuation of the morning session with the same title, but we have a different introducer to the topic, and we have, of course, different speakers in the discussion. My name is Andrei Richter. I'm senior advisor to the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media. We will structure the session as before. There will be a speech by the introducer for about 10 minutes. Then there will be discussion from the participants. So far, the list contains 27 names. So please feel free to add your name to the list held by the ADIR. Then there will be right of reply and possibility for the introducer to sum up the discussion. As always, I request everybody to speak on the topic. And once again, the topic is safety of journalists. It has been mentioned already several times. The selection of the topic is related to the decision adopted by the OSCE Ministerial Council in December of last year, safety of journalists, and we hope that the discussion will give us all food for thought and plans of action in order to make safety of journalists a fact in the OSCE region. Let me introduce in a few words the introducer. Neni Jansen is director of the Digital Freedom Fund, founding director of this fund. The fund in itself supports partners in Europe to advance digital rights through strategic litigation. She is a recognized international lawyer and expert in human rights litigation. She is responsible for groundbreaking freedom of expression cases across several national and international jurisdictions. Neni is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School and an associate tenant at Doughty Street Chambers. She is an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where she was a fellow and has been an advisor to Harvard Cyber Law Clinic since 2016. Neni, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce this working session on legal threats to the media. The media plays a crucial role in a democratic society. They enable the proper functioning of a democracy by both serving as a public watchdog and a crucial means for producing and circulating information in the public interest. This has been repeatedly emphasized by the European Court of Human Rights. Freedom of the press, the court has stated, affords the public one of the best means of discovering and forming an opinion of the ideas and attitudes of their political leaders. In particular, it gives politicians the opportunity to reflect and comment on the preoccupations of public opinion. It thus enables everyone to participate in the free political debate, which is at the very core of the concept of a democratic society. This was also clearly acknowledged in Ministerial Council Decision number 3 of 2018, which was adopted last year in Milan. And it states that independent media are essential to a free and open society and accountable systems of government, and are of particular importance in safeguarding human rights and fundamental freedoms. This role, however, is often threatened. In previous sessions, participants have discussed online and physical threats, and now we will turn our attention to legal threats to the media. This type of threat was also explicitly addressed in Decision 318, as we will examine in a moment. To introduce the discussion, I will first address 3 ways in which the legal environment can threaten the media: by weaponizing civil litigation, by criminalizing journalism, and by eroding legal protections for journalism. After this, I will make a set of recommendations on what states can do to protect journalists. So the first way in which the legal environment can threaten the media is by weaponizing civil litigation. Defamation, privacy, data protection, and other laws can be weaponized by bringing claims against the press. This has a number of detrimental effects. First, a dispute moves the issue that is being debated from the public and political arena to the private and legal arena. Threats to take legal measures against the media are often private and confidential. The public does not see any of the exchanges on the issue. And often, those bringing a claim will also try to get an injunction as quickly as possible to suppress the story. These factors can result in not only the journalist or the outlet against whom the claim is brought to avoid the story, it can also deter the media in general. As everything is taking place in the private sphere, the public will not know of the reasons why or hear about the underlying story. And this, of course, is a limitation to the free flow of information as well as a deficit in transparency. Second, litigation is time-consuming and a significant distraction. Defending a legal claim can be an incredibly time-consuming endeavor that can take many years. Some cases can take as much as 10 years in only the national system alone, let alone the time that it might take it to appeal a negative decision. This is a distraction for the journalist who will be taken away from their work while they deal with the legal threat. Third, defending litigation is resource intensive. Having to defend a claim means that resources, time and money are redirected away from political activism or journalism. And in some cases, the cost can actually drain the finances of the journalist or outlet to such an extent that they can no longer continue with their profession. Fourth, lawsuits can join the personal and the political. The threat and pursuit of litigation not only sends a message to journalists to not talk about certain topics, it can also signal a warning to journalists to not go after particularly litigious personalities. As a result, those individuals enjoy reduced scrutiny from the media, affecting the media's watchdog role. Fifth, litigation can harm a journalist's reputation. Frivolous or vexatious cases can force journalists to admit that they were wrong, even if they are acting well within their right to freedom of expression. This can have a knock-on effect for their reputation and actually open them to further criticism in their work. And finally, individual journalists are particularly vulnerable in all of this. And freelance journalists who have in their contracts clauses such as warranties and indemnities that offload the risk for litigation to the publisher or the freelance towards the freelance journalist, And many jurisdictions actually do not provide legal aid to assist in the defending of such claims. The second way in which the legal environment can threaten the media is by criminalizing journalism. National security, anti-terrorism, and criminal defamation laws are all examples of legislation that has been used to criminalize journalistic activities. These laws bring with them all the problems that I mentioned just now in the context of civil litigation, but they have a number of additional drawbacks. While civil lawsuits are often brought by powerful individuals or bigger institutions, engaging the criminal justice system means that the full weight of the state apparatus is brought to bear on the person or media outlet defending the case. Also, the journalist runs the risk of receiving a criminal penalty, which sometimes can mean a hefty fine, but it can also mean imprisonment. And for some crimes, a journalist can be held in pretrial detention, which can be for prolonged periods of time, especially in case of anti-terrorism and national security charges. This imposes an enormous emotional burden and sometimes also a financial one, and makes the preparation of a defense more difficult. And if the case is lost, the journalist can end up with a criminal record, which can damage their reputation and credibility, as well as have negative effects on many of other aspects of their lives. A third way in which the media is being legally threatened is the erosion of legal protections for journalists. An example of this is laws that allow for bulk surveillance, which means that everyone, including journalists, is being surveilled. Anti-terrorism laws are another example, as those can provide options to compel journalists reporting on national security to disclose their sources. Laws like these that have a general application that can have a negative impact on journalism without containing explicit safeguards for the media, or that leave the definition of such protections to individual states, an example of that is the GDPR, result in a patchy landscape of protection. A system that is marred with loopholes is an open invitation to those wanting to pursue a specific journalist or media outlet to engage in forum shopping, to select the jurisdiction where there is the least protection for the media to pursue their claim. This creates a landscape of great uncertainty for the media on where and how they might be subjected to legal threats, all the more so in light of the transnational nature that news has and journalism has in a digital age. So to conclude then, what can states do to protect the media from legal threats? There are three main recommendations to be made in this regard. First is that laws should be of sufficient quality. That means that the standards need to be carefully drafted, sufficiently precise, and not leave room for arbitrary application. Standards should be very clear on what type of conduct is or is not allowed. Overly broad and vaguely formulated legal provisions that leave a wide range of discretion to those deploying the law against a journalist should be avoided. Second, where laws of general application that can have a negative impact on the media are adopted, such as surveillance and anti-terrorism laws, these laws need to provide for explicit and meaningful protections. Third, the implementation and application of legislation needs to be undertaken from a perspective of proportionality and premised on a narrow approach of what necessitates a restriction of the right to freedom of the press. These recommendations, in essence, are no more than a recommendation to adhere to established standards of human rights law when it comes to states' obligation to protect the right of freedom of expression, including that of the media. And decision number 318 addressed this clearly by recommending that states bring their laws, policies and practices pertaining to media freedom fully in compliance with their international obligations and commitments, and to review and where necessary repeal or amend them so that they do not limit the ability of journalists to perform their work independently and without undue interference. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to a productive working session.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you also for putting it in the context of the ministerial decision. And if I may summarize it in one phrase, it's basically about the abuse of rule of law, of sacred rule of law, for political reasons, and what is to be done with this from the legal viewpoint. We have so far 27 speakers. The time limit for each will be 4 minutes, so quite a lot compared to the previous sessions. I would like also to remind that we kindly request that filming with cameras and video is not conducted, or if conducted by accredited journalists, is conducted only with the permission of those that they film. That speakers speak from behind the signs which clearly mark them as a group or as a country. That all interventions are in a meaningful, orderly and respectful manner, observing the time limit, which is, as I said, is quite generous, 4 minutes, and focusing on the recommendations related to the topic of our session. Please keep your comments brief and to the point, starting with recommendations if it is possible. Lengthy statements can be distributed through document distribution, so please make them available to adhere so that they are distributed. The first on the speakers list is United Kingdom, to be followed by Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am honoured to speak on behalf of the European Union. The following countries associate themselves and align with this statement: Albania, Liechtenstein, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. At the most recent OSCE summit in Astana, now Nur-Sultan, in 2010, participating states reiterated that human rights and fundamental freedoms are inalienable, expressing their conviction that the inherent dignity of the individual is at the core of comprehensive security. Looking at the conflicts in the OSCE region, this holds true. Freedom of expression, including safety of journalists, is not only a human right under international law and OSCE commitments, but is a cornerstone of any democratic, peaceful, and prosperous society. It remains a top EU priority, including in the OSCE. We are therefore concerned about the abuse in some participating states of notions such as national security, anti-terrorism, anti-extremism, and incitement to hatred, For example, excessive legislation against terrorism, which has served effectively to criminalize legitimate journalistic activity in Turkey. We express our hope that the acquittal of Reporters Without Borders Turkey representative Erol Onderoglu and others this July will reflect positively on the many similar cases of journalists in jail on terrorism charges. And we note that Mr. Onderoglu still faces other charges related to his work. The European Union notes that a prisoner exchange has also taken place between Russia and Ukraine. This means that finally, Oleg Sentsov, Pavlo Hryb, Edem Bekerov, and the 24 captured Ukrainian soldiers and others whose release we have called for so many times are free and back in their country. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all other Ukrainian citizens who have been captured by Russia on the Crimean Peninsula in violation of international law. Whenever governments consider restrictions on freedom of expression in the name of national security, these must be provided by law, serve legitimate interests as defined in international law, and be necessary and proportionate. A growing concern in this context is disinformation and propaganda, both in terms of the threat that it poses to our societies and the countermeasures governments take. The EU is concerned about the continued Russian use of disinformation campaigns to distort media space in the OSCE region as a key tool of its destabilizing actions abroad, and we will continue to challenge such attempts by building EU resilience, standing up for freedom of expression and a free and independent media, and by encouraging media literacy and critical thinking as the antidote. The EU is also worried about governments engaging in censorship as an answer to disinformation, real or alleged, and we are concerned in general by attempts to brand independent media as fake or lying, thereby undermining journalism. Disinformation and propaganda require further attention in the OSCE region, and we welcome the work of the OSCE representative in this regard. And in Budapest and in Istanbul, participating states recalled the risks of depriving citizens of a free media. In conclusion, we would like to put forward the following recommendations to participating states. First, fully respect their international obligations and commitments on freedom of expression and media freedom, in particular to refrain from unduly and disproportionately restricting freedom of expression, online and offline, under the guise of national security concerns, such as fighting extremism or terrorism. Second, devote special attention to the phenomenon of disinformation campaigns. Third, respect the freedom of expression and refrain from propaganda for wars of aggression. And fourth, engage constructively with the representative on freedom of the media and make use of his expertise and recommendations, respecting the mandate and autonomy of the representative, and provide him with the necessary resources to fulfill the mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. Denmark, to be followed by Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to deliver the following remarks on behalf of the informal OSCE group of Friends on Safety of Journalists, which is composed by Austria, Canada, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and Denmark. In December last year, all 57 participating states of the OSCE adopted a Ministerial Council decision on safety of journalists. We welcome its adoption, which was timely. Now it's time to focus on its implementation. We encourage journalists and other media actors, as well as civil society representatives, to study it carefully, use it, and support its implementation. The human right of freedom of expression and the free flow of information is under attack as journalists and other media actors across our region continue to be subjected to human rights violations and abuses, including killings, torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, intimidation, and threats. Such attacks cannot and should not be tolerated. Free, diverse, and independent media is a cornerstone of all democratic societies and is essential for our comprehensive security. Impunity for attacks on the free media cannot be accepted, and more needs to be done to implement our shared commitments. Earlier today, we organized a side event focusing on how to build digital safety for journalism. The event served to underline key challenges related to the digital safety of journalists and other media actors and ways to address these. All journalists face specific risks in the digital context. It is of critical importance that these are effectively addressed. Arbitrary or unlawful interference with journalists' use of the digital space must be stopped. Political leaders and public authorities must refrain from intimidating, threatening, or condoning violence against journalists, also in the digital space. We must all unequivocally condemn any kind of violence against journalists, their sources, and other human rights defenders. Women journalists and media actors face a specific risk, particularly in digital contexts, and we strongly support that the OSCE representative of freedom of the media pays special attention to this issue. More has to be done to stop sexual harassment, abuse, intimidation, threats and violence, including through digital technologies, towards women journalists and media actors. We will remain committed to enhancing our efforts to ensure the safety of journalists and other media actors in the OSCE region and fight impunity. We encourage others to do likewise. We will stay engaged through the OSCE and its representative on freedom of the media, who has our full support. As clearly demonstrated today, the role of civil society is unquestionable when it comes to defending democracy, freedom of expression, and safety of journalists and media actors. You have our full support. Thank you, Ms. Moderator.
Thank you. Russian Federation, to be followed by Eurasian Dialogue Institution.
Спасибо.
Thank you. As the first session showed, a number of delegations continue to use this platform to discuss off-topic topics. The issue of the safety of journalists. We call on everyone not to make irrelevant politicized statements, especially when it comes to the territorial integrity of Russia. The Russian Federation is taking an active part in international institutions to ensure the safety of journalists, preventing them having their rights violated during armed conflicts. Specifically, we've made a substantial contribution to the decision that was taken by the OSCE in Milan in 2018 in December. We do not agree with those who say that additional international legal standards are required in this sphere. In line with international humanitarian law, journalists are considered to be civilians in events of armed conflict and enjoy the requisite protection. Additional regulations are unnecessary as the status of the safety of journalists is already protected. The same goes for dividing up journalists based on their gender. We believe that all journalists should enjoy equal rights without any discrimination. We believe that there are no legal grounds to put bloggers and professional journalists on an equal footing. The same can be said for citizen journalists, because this narrows the definition of journalists. The status of media workers should only be conferred based on national legislation and on the grounds of these people actually engaging in journalistic activities, not simply because they have certain political views and positions. We believe that the status of journalists should not be conferred to civilians who have nothing to do with the media. We're in favor of an unswerving commitment to protecting journalists so that all media workers can perform their professional duties. We're constantly updating our national legislation in order to improve our law enforcement activities in this area. Currently, we're developing a piece of legislation, in fact a regulation, which foresees compensation for journalists who were subjected to rights violations when they were on duty. We are also setting standards for compensation in instances where that journalist becomes disabled or dies as a result of violations. We are also promoting the involvement of the journalistic and expert community in the drafting of that regulation. In May, the Russian Press Union, and together with the representative of the President of the Russian Federation, a monitoring center was set up which will coordinate all of the information we receive about journalist rights violations. We have specific training courses which are organized on an annual basis by the Press Union together with various ministries, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defense. The aim here is to prepare journalists to work in crisis situations such as counterterrorism, operations, mass unrest, inter alia. Those who undergo this training course acquire skills which will allow them to stay alive and also to operate in very dangerous conditions as they seek to fulfill their duties. I would like to underscore yet again that we're in favor of wholehearted cooperation with the various relevant international bodies, first and foremost with the OSCE, RFOM, Mr. Harlem Desir, and professional journalistic associations which aim to uphold journalists' rights and ensure their safety.
Eurasian Dialogue Institution to be followed by the United States of America.
Good afternoon. Thank you for our speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm coming from Tajikistan. I'm journalist Humaira Bakhtiar. So here I just want to start my speech with like a where Tajik journalists can be in safety and who can help, because when in Tajikistan was cracked down, as I reminded yesterday, in 2015 in Tajikistan was cracked down, and after which around 50 journalists fled to another countries, we still continuing to get some horrible signals from our family members. So if in previously years government persecuted us, because I am personally left Tajikistan in 2016 after long years of persecution. So right now government trying to control myself or my activity in Europe, especially through my family. My father was invited periodically. He is inviting by intelligence service and police office in Dushanbe, and the last time when he was invited in June 2019, and when my father called me from police office, and I had a chance to talk with this policeman, in which who is saying me just that I should return because there was opened a criminal case against me, and the reason of this criminal case just my activity in Europe, that I'm taking part in international conferences and having speech against Tajikistan system. So that's why, unfortunately, this is not just my cases or my life or my family, because another of my colleagues who is living in Europe, for example, one of my colleagues, unfortunately, I cannot give his name, who is based in Warsaw. Another of my colleagues who is based in Netherlands or France. Our family members are still under the pressure, and actually, I don't know what to do, because last time in June when my father was invited and he got a signal that if I will not go back, he will be arrested, I hadn't no any chance, and I started openly to talk about it. Here I have a chance to, like, I appreciate OSCE office, especially Mr. Harlem Desir and his office, that they are reacted quickly and it really helped. So since that period until my father was not invited to intelligence service or a police office, but still I'm afraid for my family safety, because I don't want to have a life that when I'm trying to do my job that my family should give for it a high price. That's why as yesterday and as like last year, I'm still calling international community help us to call Tajikistan that they should stop this kind of terrible or horrible of method to using our family members to control us, because journalism is having nothing with any extremism idea, or I don't know, which is so popular in Tajikistan. When there is any journalist who has own opinion, they will immediately call you extremist journalist or who is against government. But this is not like this. We are just trying to do our work Me personally, I whole time, like 10 years I worked, and whole time I tried just to inform our community what's going in our country, what kind of right we have in our country. And I think that it's too normal. So that's why thanks a lot for this kind of meetings in which only we can share our problems and idea, and I hope that you can help us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. United States of America, to be followed by Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety.
Mr. Moderator, the United States chooses in its statement to focus on the challenges and threats that are facing women journalists in the OSCE area. Being a journalist sometimes means putting oneself literally in the line of fire to cover breaking stories. As the participating states recognized in the Milan Ministerial Council decision on the safety of journalists, women journalists face distinct risks in the conduct of their work. Sexualized and hateful rhetoric plagues women journalists around the world. Far more often than men, women journalists are the targets of verbal abuse, especially online. According to a recent International Federation of Journalists survey, almost 2/3 of women journalists, about 64%, have received online death or rape threats, sexist comments, obscene images, or have been victims of cyber stalking. An International Women's Media Foundation survey found that more than half of women in the media have suffered threats or physical attacks. Nearly 1/3 have considered leaving the profession because of it. Women journalists have demonstrated extraordinary bravery in the Russian Federation, the most deadly place for journalists in the OSCE region. Anna Poloskovskaya and Natalia Estimirova were both murdered in 2008 and 2009, respectively, for their critical reporting on Chechnya. Russia has failed to conduct a thorough, impartial, and effective investigation into the murders. Ukraine saw a 50% increase in physical assaults against female journalists in 2018. Impunity from prosecution after these attacks is at the core of this troubling rise. For instance, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty anti-corruption reporter Katerina Kapildyuk and a cameraman were assaulted by government officials as they were attempting to conduct an interview in a village in the Kyiv region in March. On July 4th, Serbian N1 TV reporter Zanja Samili received death threats via social media, including some allegedly against her daughter. Tanya Viltekovsky also faced death threats against her and her daughter because of her reporting. Her attacker received 8 months of house arrest. Serbia should do more to punish online abusers and to protect and defend the courageous work of women journalists. In March 2019, the United States honored Montenegrin investigative journalist Olivera Lakic within the Secretary's International Women of Courage Award for her work to uncover crime and corruption despite repeated threats to herself and her daughter. In April, after running an audio tape of journalist in exile Savinik Osmankili phone conversation with a German-based journalist, Azerbaijan's pro-government Real TV made salacious comments about her and threatened to publish alleged intimate photos of her. Various other government-influenced or government-operated media outlets harassed Osmankiji, made spurious charges about an alleged intimate relationship and otherwise impugned her character. We hope that participating states will continue to work with Mr. Desir and his office to ensure protections are enforced and that crimes committed online and off against women journalists are investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, and then Uspішна Варта.
Thank you, Moderator. I would like briefly to respond to some of the information provided by a previous speaker. It has been stated that I deceive the audience, but everything that I said in the first session was true. My brother was never an employee of the Secret Services. He was simply a member of the armed forces, and now he has left the armed forces and he works with our organization. He's an ordinary journalist. Now, we have a live stream in English and Russian. I mean, I don't need to film myself. I've been accused of filming myself while speaking, but it's all streamed. I don't need to do that. Let's get back to the facts. As for legal assistance that Azerbaijani journalists need so much, I mean, I've told you that we have 6 people in prison starting in 2005. And a few dozen journalists have lost their lives. One was found hanging in his room. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Armen Komendarov died in prison, and he was waiting for 40 days to have a lawyer come and protect him. And we were looking for the financial resources to hire a lawyer, but there were so many political prisoners that it wasn't possible, and so the individual died in prison. My other brother, and the previous speaker knows him very well. He's an anti-corruption blogger. He was in prison for 2 years. He was tortured. There were dozens of court hearings. And as of today, only 30% of the costs of his legal defense have been covered by international assistance. I mean, we simply don't have the resources to deal with all of this. Previously, we didn't have problems like this in Azerbaijan. The participating states of the OSCE were very friendly to us, but there's a lack of coordination. This case of my brother, who's a very well-known journalist, he wasn't able to obtain a timely legal defense. Some of these journalists are spending months in prison waiting for lawyers, and there are very few of these lawyers, and the financial resources are not sufficient.
Talking about the aid to his brother, so it's out of topic. He should be talk about the safety of journal, not about the donors' aid.
I'm talking about aid
He's
for
just searching the donors,
journalist
so
safety.
it's out of topic.
Legal
Please
protection
take
is
into
what's
account this.
important
Thank you
part
very
of the
much.
journalist safety.
Point
Patient
taken.
speaking.
Please continue.
К сожалению, Азербайджан
Unfortunately, the authorities of Azerbaijan do not recognize that legal defense is an important component of the safety of journalists. I mean, journalists die in prison. They end up being found hanged in prison. And this is supposedly, and then they're charged with murder. Now, I would appeal to the ambassador of the United States who has spoken about attacks on women journalists in Azerbaijan. But there is a woman journalist who is now in the United States. There are threats against her from internet trolls. There's libel against her. Things are said about her that are absolutely untrue, especially by the radio stations that are under control of the presidential administration. Hajid Ismailov, in 2012, the authorities installed secret equipment in her home. Our organization was able to prove that this was installed by the Ministry of National Security on the orders of the president. And that was because she was engaged in anti-corruption investigations. But nobody has been found accountable for this. But there are many such cases, and these cases are all subject to impunity. They're not investigated, and we as civil society in Azerbaijan simply do not have the resources required to defend ourselves in the national courts and the international courts. And in closing, I would just like to say that yes, the countries of the EU, Canada, and the United States, they do assist us. We are not left helpless, but they help us once we go to the European courts. And in the national courts, we simply don't have access to legal defense.
Make all the delegations as well as the NGO, civil society to follow the rules of the conference. Thank you very much.
Мы предлагаем создать
We are proving that Harlem Desir set up a special fund that could be used to pay the costs of legal defense of journalists in order that they not end up dying in prison. Sorry, please do not exceed the time available to you.
The rules of the organization, points of order are taken by the delegations only, and only in regards to the procedure of the meeting, not the content of the meeting. Thank you very much. As to the content, there is also a right of reply, the privilege that the delegations have. Uspішна Варта to be followed by Freedom House. Микрофон, пожалуйста.
Microphone, please.
Меня уполномочили.
I am here representing 100 Ukrainian journalists who unfortunately could not come and they cannot fully exercise their duties in Kiev. It's an open secret that the previous government and also the current government funds neo-Nazi groups. These are paramilitaries which are tasked by the government to prevent mass protests from taking place. They prevent journalists from doing their job. For instance, I work for the News One TV channel. We all heard over the last few days what's happening in and around that channel. Because the new government, headed by President Zelensky, he wants to shut down that channel and to revoke the license. So these supposed activists are being funded by the government. They've got rubber batons, they've got handcuffs, they have weapons as well. They've bought military uniforms, and they're using all of them. And we, representatives of the opposition media, don't have the opportunity anymore to work in and around where all of the government buildings are, where the Verkhovna Rada sits, and so on and so forth. Because if we come with our cameramen, if they see any opposition journalists in that sector, they come up to us and start threatening us, including threatening to use physical force against us. For instance, I was attacked on 6 separate occasions. And then, of course, I went to the police, I reported this. I filed a report, but I do want to underscore that not once did the police register the criminal charges I wanted to bring. Because, of course, the criminal code does stipulate that the safety of journalists must be ensured. However, no one has been convicted of impeding the exercising of journalist rights. Furthermore, these groups are funded as if they were police assistants. In other words, these are brigades which assist the law enforcement authorities. They enjoy almost the same status as law enforcement authorities do. So if someone attacks me and I fight back to defend myself, it will be construed as if I myself, for instance, struck a representative of law enforcement. Furthermore, there are cases when, for instance, the Ministry of Youth and Sport, what happened is that this year, the ministry spent millions in taxpayers' money to defend those who were accused of killing that journalist, Alessia Buzina. They walked free. The people who possibly killed that journalist. So that money was channeled to ensure that the perpetrators of that crime walked free. Now, I understand that in any normal country, the law enforcement authorities need to fight terrorism, illegal use of weapons, and so on and so forth. But Ukraine has gone one step further. Not only are they fighting these organizations, they're also funding them. Therefore, I call on the OSCE to look into the situation in the Ukraine to ensure that journalists no longer fall prey to right-wing groups funded by the government?
Urge to start with recommendations. If you have recommendations, start with recommendations in your speeches. Freedom House to be followed by Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen, bitte.
Moderator, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'll start with my recommendations and move on to the text. Freedom House calls on the governments of Azerbaijan, Turkey, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the de facto authorities in Crimea, as well as the authorities wherever journalists face harassment, violence, and smear campaigns, to establish oversight mechanisms open to public scrutiny to ensure that attacks and incidents of violence against journalists will be thoroughly investigated and perpetrators held to account, to establish a mechanism to prevent the political misuse of assorted criminal charges against journalists for their work on politically sensitive material or critical perspective of the government, to cease persecution of journalists representing marginalized communities, especially Crimean Tatar citizen journalists and human rights reporters and Kurdish journalists in Turkey, and to seek assistance from the ODIHR and the RFOM to review existing and draft legislation seeking to improve media freedom and journalist safety and implement the proposed recommendations. Now I'll move to my text. Freedom House is gravely concerned by the growing trend of attacks and acts of intimidation against journalists in a number of OSCE participating states. Over the last year, physical violence, punitive legal measures, smear campaigns, and other forms of harassment have been used in an attempt to silence critical voices in Azerbaijan, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Russia, Crimea, and Ukraine. Critical voices are often silenced through government abuse of the court system, where allegations of criminality are used as instruments to stifle journalists who investigate public interest topics. Ikram Rakhimov, editor-in-chief of Realik, was arrested in 2018 shortly after he published an editorial about corruption in Azerbaijan's press council, receiving a 5.5-year sentence. Ivan Golunov, a well-respected Russian investigative journalist, was arrested on drugs charges, a tactic that is often used to smear and silence credible and vital voices in Russia. In a surprising response to mass protests in support of the journalist, Golunov was released for lack of evidence. In Kazakhstan, RFE-RL correspondent Sanya Toykin was fined and detained while covering ongoing protests by oil workers unfolding in the Zhanaozen for refusal to follow police orders. Allegations of terrorism are used as tools to silence journalists, particularly those representing or covering marginalized communities. In July in Turkey, 2 filmmakers who were developing a documentary on the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party were sentenced to over 4 years in prison for making propaganda for a terrorist organization. In Crimea, professional Crimean Tatar media has been essentially extinguished. Impunity for violence against journalists remains among the biggest challenges facing media freedom in Ukraine. The Institute of Mass Information documented 88 incidents of physical aggression against journalists in the first half of 2019 alone. The murder of Pavlo Sheremet remains unsolved. Vadim Komarov, an investigative journalist known for his work on public interest issues in Cherkasy, was attacked with a hammer in May and died of his injuries later that month. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you, Mark. Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen to be followed by NGO Sadokat.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'd like to start my statement with a general declaration. As you will remember, at a previous session, I talked about the fate of a witness to a crime committed by the armed forces yesterday, and there was an attempt to kidnap him, but the forces of law and order of Denmark did their job properly, and so the kidnapping did not occur, and I would call on the Danish authorities through the representative here to provide him with 24-hour protection, because he is a target for the Uzbek forces of law and order. Now, the Uzbek authorities claim that there is freedom of speech, that there's a reform, but that's not true. At the Tashkent University, there's a troll factory using contemporary technology. They work for $200 to $800 per month salary, and they target anyone who criticizes the regime, who thinks differently, including people who are abroad and are expressing their opinions freely. Furthermore, a journalist, Malahat Eshava, and a human rights defender, was to be present today, but she was not allowed to leave the country under falsified criminal charges, and she was not able to leave the country even though she received a visa to attend this event. She has turned to the president, the Speaker of the General Assembly, and various other prominent personalities, and yet she was not able to leave. And despite that, the Uzbek authorities are claiming that the reform is underway. And the troll factory also has me as a target. My accounts are constantly blocked. I'm not able to publish my video films on YouTube or on Facebook. I don't know how they've managed to do this, but I'm unable to publish my statements. In August of 2016, there was a major transport event was to have Mirzaev and the head of the Secret Service in Uzbekistan. Well, I think that it would be more effective if we speak to the subject that is on the agenda for today. Thank you. Perhaps you can speak closer to the subject of today's session, safety of journalists. Well, I would ask for more tolerance. On my accounts, I have posted something to the effect that the authorities should draw attention to this event on transport, and that post was deleted. A colleague of mine put it on his page, and it was deleted there. I put it on YouTube, and YouTube also deleted it. So this troll factory is working very effectively. So I would call upon you to be very careful about information whose source is in Uzbekistan. That is all a deceit, and it needs to be treated with great prudence and caution. Thank you.
Participants to speak in a respectful manner. Sadagat to be followed by International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Semiev Kabaljon, and I head up a civil society organization. Speaking here to representatives of the OSCE, as well as to journalists from various countries, I would like to declare that in Tajikistan, the role the media plays is extremely important and is most influential. Journalists in my country are conducting investigations and reporting on all sorts of topics. In particular, they've focused a great deal on the pointless war which took place in Tajikistan in the 1990s. The journalists have managed to bring to justice most of the people who were responsible for that war. The Secretariat of the OSCE will be receiving a copy of the articles penned by these journalists so that they can draw their own conclusions. Those who spoke before me tarnished my country's reputation. To them, I say this: the people of Tajikistan will not support you, because you killed very well-known journalists, media workers, and innocent people. Thank you for your kind attention. And here I have copies of the articles. I will be submitting those to the Secretariat. Thank you very much.
International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People to be followed by delegation of Netherlands.
Dear participants, this is the third day that we've been talking about the profession of journalism, and we talk about it less as a romantic profession. We talk more about how much risk is experienced by journalists. Not only when there is a military conflict, but even in peaceful areas, there can be risks, there can be threats. And it all depends on the situation in the country, on the leadership, and on the forces of law and order. And even in this room, there is a front line in some sense. We all tend to divide journalists into ours and theirs. At the beginning of this session, the introducer even, one of the speakers defined journalists as the watchdogs, and that was in the morning. And freedom for Sentsov was something that we have seen on T-shirts in this room as well. But for a few days, we've talked also about Subyzhny, a Ukrainian journalist who has died. But we don't talk about the United States, England, France, and Canada. They are delighted with the new Ukrainian authorities. But these words of praise about Ukraine include the following: new freedom. This was said by Kurt Volker, who said recently in public that freedom of expression is in good shape and it's improving. Now Ukrainians now have the possibility freely to express their opinions. Now the words of Kurt Volker are not perceived as interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine. We're used to this. I mean, this is the policy of the most democratic country in the world. I mean, they can allow themselves to do that. They have hundreds of military bases all around the world and the largest military. But in 2016, at the time of the elections in Germany, I produced a few reports about what I saw at polling stations. And then one of my readers in the United States of America wrote the following text: had you written the same about American elections, then you would be subject to judicial proceedings because you would be charged with putting into doubt the fairness of the judiciary in the United States. Now, it is a court decision. It should be a court decision to identify an individual as a criminal or an offender. So we believe that information about volunteers in Donbass, about the shooting down of the Boeing, yes, that was a terrible tragedy, but the decision of the court will come down in 2020. But from the very first moment of this tragedy in 2014, it was pre-decided that it was the Donbass volunteers and the Russians who were to blame, and that was a decision or judgment handed down by media in Western Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, esteemed government and civil society representatives. The Kingdom of the Netherlands fully associates itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union. I would like to add a few words in my national capacity as the Dutch Human Rights Ambassador. A free press is essential for a functioning democracy and free society, and I would add sustainable development. Journalists show us our visions and our divisions. This makes good journalism part of good governance. Where there is debate, democracy flourishes. Where views clash, the truth emerges. In all this, journalists play a central role. The Netherlands is a firm supporter of freedom of expression offline and online, at home and around the world. We are a staunch advocate of an independent and pluralist media with special attention for women in the media. The importance of the free media and independent journalism should really be, in our view, readily self-evident. It is alarming that many journalists are killed every year. simply for covering the news and sharing information with a wider audience. For their words, for their work. In 90% of the cases, the perpetrator goes unpunished. This climate of impunity perpetuates a cycle of violence against journalists and the media. This is unacceptable. That is why the safety of journalists is a priority of the Dutch human rights policy. We are concerned that female journalists are particularly at risk. Dutch activities to enhance protection include online and offline safety training courses, support for the adoption of effective legislation, and the provision of safe spaces on a temporary or permanent basis for threatened journalists. In addition, the Netherlands seeks to ensure the prosecution of people who physically or verbally threaten journalists. In closing, to underscore our resolve to protect media freedom, the Netherlands will join UNESCO in organizing the Conference for World Press Freedom Day in The Hague on 22 to 24 April next year. We are grateful for the opportunity to make this contribution and welcome your input. And we, of course, hope to see many of you there. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. Association of Central Asian Migrants to be followed by Article 19.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Rahmanov Nasrullah. I'm a member of the Association of Central Asian Migrants. Ladies and gentlemen, given the topic at hand, we cannot but mention our journalists, prisoners of conscience. After the events which took place in 2015 and the groundless accusations against my organization, we were accused of terrorism, in fact, and as was the political party. 5 members of the PIVT political party were attacked, and some of them were sentenced to time in prison, as were some journalists. Some were sentenced to life in prison. Mahmoud-Ali Hait was sentenced to life in prison, in fact, and what we've seen is very often torture is deployed. However, some have said that he and his colleagues were convicted because of their political activities, not because of their professional activities. However, Mahmoud-Ali Hait has always used as his sword solely the pen and his word, as he has sought to uphold civil liberties and political rights of his citizens. He, in fact, is the only one who wrote about the shooting of demonstrators in front of the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Tajikistan on the 12th of February 1990. Because of that report, he was fired from his job on state radio. This morning, at a side event, a representative of the Tajik delegation showed us a statement which is purportedly something that was written by Mahmoud-Ali Hait. That statement says that on the 11th as of the 11th of the 9th, 2019, he has never been tortured. The fact that the statement, which would have been in the hands of the prosecution, found its way into the hands of a representative of the official delegation here at an ODIHR conference, attests to the fact that torture was used, was deployed, at least psychological torture. Also, the fact that this statement is being disseminated here attests to the fact that the official delegation is disseminating fake news. Ladies and gentlemen, I just have one recommendation. I speak to you as representatives of an international organization. Please do everything within your power to ensure that the Tajik government implements at least one of the UN Human Rights Council recommendations or the recommendations of the UN Working Group on Unlawful Detention. We call on the Tajik government also to free Mahmoud-Ali Hait. His life is hangs in the balance. The fact that he has been tortured was something he mentioned to his wife. I do apologize. The speaker should speak to the topic. He was not a journalist. He was the deputy head of the party Islamic Renaissance of Tajikistan. Well, that information is available if you want to look into that. Please finish your statement. That's it. Thank you very much.
Article 19 to be followed by delegation of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Article 19 welcomes the focus of the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting and of the Global Media Freedom Campaign on legal threats against journalists, and the inclusion of solutions in the Ministerial Decision 318. Article 19 looks forward to working with the Member States to ensure the implementation of Recommendation 2, to bring Member States' laws into full compliance with their international obligations. We are particularly concerned by the weaponization of the law and the judiciary against journalists in Turkey, in particular, the misuse of anti-terror and defamation laws. It is now over 3 years since the Turkish government intensified its crackdown against opposition and dissenting voices in the country. The ongoing freedom of expression crisis demands urgent attention from all OSCE members. We call on all states to use their voices and urge Turkey to take immediate steps to repeal these laws and bring them into line with Turkey's international obligations. No judicial reform will be credible without this crucial first step. Since 2016, at least 180 media outlets have been forcibly closed and over 220,000 websites are blocked in Turkey. More than 131 journalists are now in detention, and hundreds more are facing criminal charges and are labeled as terrorists for their journalistic work in the absence of any credible evidence. Although a 2-year state of emergency was lifted in July 2018, the sweeping emergency decrees have now effectively been absorbed into the ordinary legal framework. This enabled the government to pursue an unprecedented crackdown against the media and civil society. Trials lack compliance with guarantees of due process and fair trial rights, as the government has dismantled the rule of law and tightened executive control of the judiciary. For example, 2 well-known and distinguished journalists, Ahmet and Mehmet Altan, were arrested 3 years ago on suspicion that they had transmitted subliminal messages in support of the coup attempt. After 18 months of pretrial detention, they were eventually charged with attempting to overthrow the state. This accusation carries a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. These charges were later revised by the Supreme Court of Appeals to the crime of supporting a terrorist organization. And rather than see justice be done and the journalist released, the judicial system is expected to retry the Altans on the 8th of October on lesser charges. In 2018, the European Court of Human Rights delivered a judgment finding a violation of Mehmet Altan's right to freedom of expression. However, we are still waiting for Strasbourg to rule on Ahmet Altan, who has now spent 3 years in prison. Ahmet Altan is now world's most famous novelist in prison and was recently nominated for the Baillie Gifford Prize, the UK's most important literary prize for non-fiction. We urge OSCE member states to make his case a priority. In recent months, the government has even sought to rewrite history, charging 16 leading civil society figures who participated in the peaceful 2013 Gezi Park protests with attempting to overthrow the government. Osman Kavala, in his 24th month of pretrial detention, he is in his 24th month of pretrial detention in a flagrant violation of his right to fair trial. We are also urgently waiting for a decision on his case from the European Court of Human Rights. Last week, the conviction of 6 Cumhuriyet journalists were overturned and they were released from prison, where they've spent at least the last 4 months. However, in the same judgment, their colleague, journalist Ahmet Sheikh, was served new unfounded charges, including propaganda for a terrorist group and insulting the Turkish state. They may see him sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegation of Ukraine to be followed by Tajik Democratic Freethinkers.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Distinguished participants of the meeting, at the outset I would like to thank introducer for her thought-provoking presentation on today's very important topic. The delegation of Ukraine strongly and unequivocally, condemns all attacks against journalists and maintain a firm view that journalist safety must be guaranteed at all times. Having taken important legislative measures to strengthen the safety of journalists and increase responsibility for obstruction of their work, the Ukrainian authorities give utmost attention to the thorough and impartial investigation of all cases of violence and intimidation of members of the media. Unfortunately, a number of cases remain unresolved. On a number of occasions, we updated the OSCE participating states about specific and important steps undertaken in the area of strengthening the environment for free media. Ukraine closely cooperates with the OSCE representative on the freedom of the media, receiving valuable expertise and assistance in enhancing the implementation of relevant commitments. We will continue to do so in the efforts to enhance media freedom and protection of journalists in the country. Ukraine's resolve to improve the environment for free media is articulated in the fact that since 2014, Ukraine's score in the World Press Freedom Index, run by the respective international NGO Reporters Without Borders, has improved by 25 points. At the same time, we regularly voice our deep concerns relating to journalist safety, significant restrictions of media freedom and freedom of expression in Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine and in Russia itself. As a country suffering from Russia's aggression, Ukraine is alarmed over the climate of impunity for attacks on journalists in the Russian Federation, which eradicates pluralism, stifles professional reporting, and leads to self-censorship. We repeatedly pointed out to a clear link between Russia's external aggression and domestic clampdown on human rights and fundamental freedoms. A real threat to press freedom in the campaign of disinformation carried out on industrial scale by Russia's state-owned media. Russian Federation remains one of the most dangerous places for journalists in the OSCE region, with the highest number of journalists brutally attacked and killed in the past 25 years. A report of journalist killings in the OSCE region since 1992, issued by the Office of the RFOM in 2017, testifies that among 400 journalists from the whole OSCE region who paid the ultimate price in the course of their work, over 170 journalists, almost half, are from Russia. The vast majority of the cases have not been investigated and perpetrators have not been brought to justice. According to 2018 Global Impunity Index of Committee to Protect Journalists, Russia is the only OSCE participated state among the spotlight countries in the world where, I quote, journalists are slain and their killers go free, end of quote. Today, remembering those who remain in illegal detentions for being defenders of the freedom of the speech, we reiterate our demand to Russia to immediately and unconditionally set free Stanislav Aseyev, Remzi Bekirov, Osman Arif Mehmetov, Rustem Sheikhaliev, Server Mustafayev, and other Ukrainian political prisoners. We recommend the OSCE representative on freedom of the media to continue his efforts to use all available instruments to facilitate immediate release of Ukrainian media workers placed in illegal detention by the Russian authorities. We also recommend the OSCE RFOM to use his personal and his office expertise to help Russia to cope with impunity of perpetrators of crimes against journalists. I thank you.
Thank you. Tajik Democratic Free Thinkers, to be followed by Belarusian Association of Journalists.
Good afternoon. Thank you, moderator. Thank you, participants. My name is Arkiev, and I am the president of the group of Democratic Free Thinkers of Tajikistan. Some of the previous speakers have, I believe, been erroneous in stating that during the Civil War the opposition is responsible for the killing of journalists. But Oleg Panafilov has written a book where he describes the killing of 83 journalists, most of whom were supporters of the reformist forces that were fighting for the independence of Tajikistan. They were liberal Democrats, and they were killed by the supporters of Rakhmonov, who fought in the alliance of the National Front. So that's my first comment. A second one, Malamit Ahidov was a journalist. He continues to be a journalist. He was a radio correspondent. Then he was the president of the radio committee. And after that, he wrote in various independent publications of Tajikistan, in particular on the website of the Islamic Renaissance Party. I'm not a member of that party, but the individual is my colleague and a friend. So don't say erroneous things about him. If you deny that he's a journalist, you might just as well deny that he's been tortured. But Comrade Stalin used to say that it's even worse. He's both a journalist and he's tortured. I mean, both are true. Now, the prosecutor, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and others really control everything when it comes to journalism. And now, in the publication house where I worked, Azaplus, I mean, they weren't able to protect me. They knew they couldn't do that. After I was doubly attacked by the prosecutor and the Secret Service. They tried to take away my telephone, my camera, my notebook, my press pass, and none of this was returned. This occurred during the Corvon scandal, and at a time when I was trying to report on a situation in a military hospital in Dushanbe, where the authorities were blocking off the city of Kharok, and it was a peaceful city, and yet they were attacking it and subjecting civilians to artillery fire. Now, another friend, a journalist, was detained, was kept in a car by a Secret Service officer, and for several hours he didn't allow her to leave the vehicle, even though she desperately needed to go to the toilet, and she was crying and asking just to go to the toilet. And he said, well, if you pee in your pants, I'll take you out of the city and you'll see what happens. So you can either leave the profession or work under those kinds of conditions, being fully controlled, and that's the way it is. It also happens on social networks. A previous speaker at this conference has authorized to tell me, for me to say that yes, you'll have to close, you're running out of time. But we have seen the bullying and the intimidation that is being aimed at these independent, free-thinking journalists. All in all, to make recommendations to the usurping autocratic regime is pointless. So I think we have to stop there.
Independent Democrats against authoritarian regimes. Пожалуйста, Андрей.
Andre, please, you have the floor.
Если можно, уступите место.
Could you please vacate your seat so he can sit down? Thank you.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak. I want to talk about an issue which was flagged by the previous speaker, as well as by some of the other people who took the floor today and over the past few days. Here at this session, specifically the sessions focused on the freedom of expression. The issue is the following: who is a journalist and who is not a journalist? Let me say right at the outset that I'm of the opinion that whether you're a journalist depends not on where you work, not on whether the government is prosecuting you, persecuting you. It hinges on your investigative work, whether you're collating information. Unfortunately, in OSCE participating states, in fact, not in all OSCE participating states, is this the opinion of the majority. This means that journalists do not enjoy due protection. Let me illustrate using an example. Last year, amendments were introduced into the media legislation in Belarus. This pertained first and foremost to the internet. In line with these amendments, in order for a media outlet to obtain that status, an online media outfit, they have to register. The registration is supposedly voluntary. However, unless you register, you will not be considered as a mass media outlet. And in fact, the registration is a very long-winded and expensive process. The outcome, 9 months after the amendments entered into force, that is on the 1st of September of this year, in Belarus, there are only 5 private internet resources which have managed to register as online mass media. Many of the other media outlets are just they're unable to jump through all of the hoops in order to register. Others haven't yet attempted to do so for some reason. And as a consequence, the journalists working for these outlets have lost the rights which go hand in hand with this registration. Their sources aren't protected. They can't receive press passes from the authorities. However, they can be detained during mass protests, detained as participants, although they're actually there reporting about what's going on at these demonstrations. And then they're charged. Criminal charges are often brought against them as they are supposedly preventing other journalists from doing their job. Although I must say that is perhaps not particularly important because since the current criminal code entered into force, these particular charges have never been brought. Those provisions have never been invoked. Of course, everything I'm saying affects not only journalists working for the online media, but it also pertains to freelancers and bloggers. I'm of the view that this issue, and this is something we've heard on numerous occasions in this room, this issue is very salient, it's very acute in many other OSCE participating states. Therefore, my recommendation is the following. The OSCE needs to assist participating states to adopt new approaches to defining who is a journalist and who is not.
International Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes, to be followed by Eurasian Expert Council Foundation, please.
Thank you. There are dictatorship states, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and aggressive Russia. And again, today, Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan has the authoritarian regime. Dictatorship have not any safety of journalists. More, all independent journalists have persecution for all time. Dear participant, today I ask your attention to Azerbaijan. The delegation Azerbaijan said that Emin Huseynov has not the citizenship of Azerbaijan. But first of all, the dictatorship of Azerbaijan annullated the citizenship of Azerbaijan for Emin Huseynov. We see that dictatorship uses all inhuman methods.
Just a second. Point of order.
Thank you very much. We're not talking about annulation of somebody's passport. We're talking about the safety of journalists and not dictatorship or anything else. Please, it should be turned to the topic, not talk about the annulation of somebody's passports. Maybe it can be journalist or somebody else.
We're talking about safety of journalists. Please continue.
Thank you. We see that dictatorship use all inhuman methods for the persecution journalists. And next, we know that there are standard OSCE and United Nations Convention. And more, we see there is a recommendation Parliament Assembly at Luxembourg of this year. Please, Azerbaijan, your attention to this recommendation. And next, to OSCE again. We regret that OSCE reject the proposition of United States America to the agenda the role of civil society and the right to a fair trial. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Eurasian Expert Council Foundation, to be followed by Croatian Journalists Association.
Thank you very much. Если позволите, на русском.
If I may, I'll be speaking in Russian. In Kazakhstan at the present time, there are two trends, two tendencies when it comes to talking about freedom of expression or the freedom of the press. I mean, there is a legal basis, there are legal standards that make it possible criminally to prosecute civil society activists and journalists, because you must understand that under Kazakhstan law, any user of social networks with 3,000 friends or more is treated formally as a journalist. And any limitations imposed on the media are imposed also on people with social network pages where they have 3,000 followers or more. And there is also an article on libel which is based on a presidential decree. It is so-called a criminal offense, and there is no precedent of people actually being put in prison, but they end up having a criminal record if they found guilty of that. So we would like to be able to work on this and to have this article deleted from the criminal code, because it does in fact restrict the activities of civil society. But things are not all that bad thanks to the legal standards. We do have a number of state institutions that provide support to civil society. At the present time in Kazakhstan, substantial amounts of money, on the order of millions of dollars, are provided to civil society activists so they can cover the legal defense costs of individuals who want to defend their interests and to defend independent journalists and so on. So with the assistance of the state, we've been able to do a number of positive things thanks to these several $1 million. There are a few projects. In all of the regions of Kazakhstan, there are legal consultancy points where human rights defenders can go for legal assistance should they need that. So we would like to draw your attention to some of those positive trends in Kazakhstan.
Followed by Azerbaijan Press Council.
Thank you. Till these 3 days we hear very different stories from all the part of the world. So from this place...
I'm sorry, will you please move to the civil society part of the table? Thank you very much. Sorry.
For these days we heard so many different stories. So from this place I want to send our big support to our colleagues which are jailed and tortured right now, especially in countries which we heard today and these days. European Association of Journalists asked for support for Turkey journalists. So I hope we learn something for Khashoggi case, for case from Malta, from Jan Kuciak. These people have faces. We talk about human beings, and after that we talk about journalists. I'm fortunate. I come from Croatia, so I can share you a little bit different view of problems. To the end of the last year, civil and criminal proceedings against journalists and media because of harm done to honor and reputation, escalating with a long-lasting problem of great number of court procedures against journalists and media. To widely understood journalist responsibility, both civil and criminal, and inconsistent case laws reach the peak at most outrageous verdict that, according to our society and the numerous law experts, resulted in freezing effects regarding media freedom. And besides case laws, there is the issue of enormous financial compensation in cases of harm done to honor and reputation. They really are inherently frightening for journalists and publishers. We have, I think, in some way unique case that Croatian public television suits almost 36 journalists and media houses. Among them is Croatian Journalists Association, and all that because of harm of honor and reputation. And we make some database, and according to partial database collected from some media houses, there are more than 1,000 procedures against journalists and media houses in Croatia at this moment. So I will take this time that once more I said that dialogue, which we open here, is very, very important. And our recommendations from Croatian Journalist Society is support media networks, ensuring the legal safety of journalists, and training for media lawyers who can help in these situations. And for the end, I can just say, if we don't take some lessons from here today, that we can open some new chapter, like famous journalist Ed Murrow said, if we do nothing, we can just say good night and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you. Azerbaijan Press Council to be followed by Azerbaijan.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I wanted to state my opinion on a number of topics. First and foremost, we have one NGO in Azerbaijan called Peaceful World. That's the title. This NGO trains journalists how to behave in extreme situations. For a number of years now, this organization has been spreading knowledge, teaching journalists so that they know how to behave appropriately in extreme circumstances. Alisfan Mehdi is the leader of that organization. He's a war correspondent. He puts together teams of journalists and visits hotspots, in other words, extreme situations. In other words, he visits regions such as the parts occupied by Armenia. Well, it's very difficult to visit those bits, those areas, but he has visited all of the contiguous regions. Moving on. There are a few points which I wanted to clarify. I do think that it's regrettable that some participants have been disseminating erroneous information, harnessing the opportunity to take the floor. For instance, Ikram Rahimov, supposedly a journalist who's supposedly behind bars because he's supposedly criticized the Azerbaijani government. But that's not really what this case is about. This man pretended to be a journalist and then blackmailed people. He blackmailed people for money, and there's evidence of this. There's a video clip of him doing this. The evidence is absolutely clear, and that is why he is behind bars. So, who in their right mind, what organization in their right mind would defend this kind of person? Who would say that his freedom of expression is being trampled? Next, the representative of the United States of America mentioned Real TV in Azerbaijan. He said that this is a pro-state channel. This is a commercial, in other words, an independent news channel. And in fact, we have 100, this TV channel is 100 times freer than so-called free Radio Liberty. Next, Taria Mangazi, who lives in the United States. This woman, this journalist, worked on state TV in Azerbaijan. Then she switched jobs, moving to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then she moved to the United States State Department, and she's never had any problems. But all of a sudden, when she ended up in the US, she became an opposition journalist and started slinging mud at everyone and anyone, including Real TV. I hope that no one's going to lead us astray talking about this case anymore. Next, yesterday, the representative of the World Uyghur Council spoke today, and I applaud him because the situation in China is such that we need to speak about. But could you please speak to the topic, says the moderator. Yes, this is speaking to the topic at hand. You see, the situation is that there are some countries which are not participating states of the OSCE which we've left behind. For instance, Iran. 40 million Azerbaijanis live in Iran, and their rights are not being protected. That's why I raised this issue. Thank you.
40 миллионов.
40 million, did you say? Says the moderator.
Of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. On behalf of Azerbaijan delegation, we thank Madam Introducer for her insightful presentation on the legal threats against the journalists. But in my statement, I will touch upon the opposite, on the legal frameworks for protection of safety of journalists. Indeed, the legal grounds of protection of journalists as much as important as the protection itself, and this is even more crucial during times of war and conflicts. Under the international humanitarian law, journalists in armed conflicts are classified as civilians, and as such should be afforded the same protection, provided that they take no action affecting their status as civilians. The UN Security Council Resolution 1738 and 2222 further strengthened the existing international norms and standards on the protection of journalists operating in situations of armed conflicts, and provided useful terms of reference for media professionals working in and reporting on the situations of armed conflicts. We are very pleased that we were able to reaffirm these resolutions in the last year's MC decision on the safety of journalists adopted in Milan Ministerial Council. In this decision, we also recalled all previous OSCE commitments, starting from the Helsinki Final Act, where us, as a participating state, took the commitment to improve working conditions under which journalists from one participating state exercises their profession in other participating states. And inter alia, among these commitments, we took the responsibility to ease procedures for arranging travel and provide opportunities for such travel for foreign journalists subject to the observance of regulations relating to existence of areas closed for security reasons. This is quote from the Helsinki Final Act. So, in a nutshell, these provisions establish a responsibility for journalists as well as a duty for the participating states to respect the regulations related to the areas closed for security reasons, mainly conflict zones, mainly the regulations related to accreditation in such zones. So, using this opportunity, we once again recommend the Office of RFIM to raise awareness among journalists, journalistic community, on existence of such regulations and frameworks, first of all for their own safety. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, to be followed by Institute for Western Ukrainian Studies.
Национальный союз журналистов Украины, секретарь.
I'm the Secretary of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, and I'm also a media lawyer, and I deal with media cases on a daily basis. And I would like to thank the rapporteur for some of the systemic points made. They are very essential for the subject of today's session. Now, starting with recommendations, mainly, I believe that the OSCE should at least once a year look at concrete recommendations to see how the concrete principles of safety of journalists are really implemented. I mean, there is erosion of human rights defense. In 28 August of last year, one of the courts of Ukraine took a decision to the effect that there should be access to SMS communications over the last 18 months. It's the Natalie Siletsky case. And then in September of the same year, last year, the European Court of Human Rights looked at this case and under accelerated procedure on the basis of Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and it took the decision to recommend to the Ukrainian authorities that this not be implemented, that this not be applied. And the lawyers called for this to be put into force, and this issue of access to the personal data of a journalist who is simply exercising the profession. So what's the recommendation? The decision of the court was very positive, but I would think that renewing this once or twice a year could be done at the level of the OSCE level. Then there's another conflictual aspect that has been discussed in this room. Who is a journalist? I mean, how do you distinguish between journalists and non-journalists? There are various articles in Ukraine that protect journalists, but then there's Article 341 that states that a journalist needs to be a member of the National Association of Journalists. But there is a contrary opinion to the effect that, and representatives of the European Court have supported this, that some YouTube bloggers and others, given that they have a much larger readership than traditional journalists, so they could be perceived as journalists as well. And yet these bloggers are not protected in Ukraine, for instance, to the same effect as a rank-and-file police officer. So I think there are certain standards that need to be looked at this. I mean, we've heard about countries where if you have 3,000 followers, and that's enough to be seen as a journalist. And then there are others who consider that it's a question of remuneration. What are the criteria to be provided? Now, then there are civil society requests for information. I mean, we said that Facebook is important for freedom of expression, but there's a big problem of unidentified users. Facebook users who can publish whatever they want, and then it's very difficult for a court to identify the individual who is behind certain publications, certain postings. And this is something that could be looked at in order to come up with recommendations, in particular that all users of social networks should be fully identifiable.
Public Association Open Dialogue.
Уважаемое председательство.
Moderator, journalists, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Oleg Havich. I'm an Ukrainian journalist, and I'm going to talk about the persecution of journalists in my country using my own life as an example. In my home country of Chernovtsi, I organized a roundtable a number of years ago dedicated to the topic of minority rights in Ukraine. There were a few military men who attended. They answered to the National Security Services of Ukraine. I was beaten up And then I was detained by the police because my attackers asked them to detain me. Then criminal charges were brought against me. I was accused of, in fact, undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The security services searched my home twice in Kiev and in Chernovtsi, and during the second search, there were representatives of the Aidar battalion present, together with members of the security services. The evidence used was the reports I'd published in the Ukrainian media, and in fact, I do not deny that I wrote those articles. In 2017, I was informed that they were planning to arrest me unlawfully. I then fled to Poland, requested asylum, and continued working as a journalist, as a freelancer now. However, the persecution continued. In October 2017, the Ukrainian security services brought even more serious charges against me. I'm now facing 10 years in prison. An institute which answers to the security services was sent my articles, the articles I wrote here in Poland, and they were to decide whether these articles threatened the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So Poland has now been accused of harboring a dangerous fugitive. Unfortunately, the change in government in Ukraine did not put an end to this persecution. For instance, here in the room, Ruslan Kasaba, Dmitry Vasilensk are here in the room. Although they've been released from prison, they still have charges against them pending. Vasily Moravsky from Zhytomyr spent a year behind bars because of the reports he published. And in fact, he's been under house arrest for some time now. Therefore, I call on the OSCE and Mr. Harlem Desir specifically, not only to state that they're worried about the persecution of journalists by the Ukrainian authorities, but to actually use all of the tools at their disposal to put an end to such persecution. Thank you.
We are coming close to the end of the discussion, so if there is anybody else wishing to take the floor, please, there is still time and place in our list of speakers. Public Association Open Dialogue, to be followed by Public Organization Public Advocacy.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like once again to draw the attention of distinguished participants to this phenomenon of modern life, namely citizen journalism. It's possible through the internet for any individual to express their views about reality. There are citizens who use cameras who on the roads of Kazakhstan, for instance, film people who are violating the rules of the road. And this is something that can be done in many countries. But there is an anachronism in this digital age, namely laws on slander and libel. There are various sanctions applied in that respect, which are in fact violations of freedom of expression. Bloggers and citizen journalists are sometimes subject to attacks, and we believe that that should be discriminalized. Legal practice has shown that individuals who are slapped with fines for this can, in fact, be intimidated from continuing their activities. As a representative of civil society of Kazakhstan, we call for libel to be decriminalized and for the corresponding article to be removed from the criminal code. We believe that this would be reasonable, and it would show that the state is interested in having a truly open society. Now, Kazakhstan has expressed that it wants to digitalize. My internet site amounts to a form of media, and of course various statements can be treated as being fallacious or libelous. A number of courts are taking advantage of this to attack people, so we believe that this proposal would also reduce the workload of Kazakhstan courts and provide resources for more significant cases. We can hope that the phenomenon of citizen journalism will continue, and my organization is certainly prepared to participate in such a process. Thank you.
To be followed by Turkmen independent journalist.
Oleg Denisov, глава НПО.
Oleg Denisov, I'm the head of this NGO, the Public Advocacy Public Organization. Now, the legal problems with safety of journalism are based first and foremost on impunity, the fact that there are no real investigations, especially in those cases when the perpetrators are well known. And I'll make a few recommendations about cases in Ukraine. We recommend to Ukrainian authorities to make sure that when these crimes are committed and the perpetrators are known, there needs to be a full investigation, a full control of that to make sure that there isn't this impunity so that the crimes will not be continued. This can be done by appealing to various sources of information. We can see from the OSCE reports that it is a problem. Now, a few words about the situation in Ukraine. Many crimes or offenses against Ukrainian journalists are committed by radicals. This was the case in 2018. There was also an attack on the Ukrainian church, and when the offices of one NGO were attacked, this was these were public offenses. There were, in fact, videos taken which were then available on Facebook. We managed to insist on the opening of a criminal investigation about these attacks, but we had to go to the court because initially the police simply refused to open an investigation. But the judiciary did insist on an investigation be opened, and even though the perpetrators did not deny that they committed these crimes, they in fact boasted about them on social networks, and yet no charges have been brought. Another point that needs to be taken into consideration is that of witnesses. We have an individual who is being persecuted for protecting the rights of the faithful of his church. Now, he should be protected by freedom of expression, and yet that principle is being ignored. And in Ukraine, it really is necessary that there be intervention by international organizations. We have been in touch with the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations. They communicated with the authorities of Ukraine. They insisted that answers be given to a whole series of questions about the violations of rights of journalists and of the faithful of our church, of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, we hope that the new president and the parliament will improve the situation, and we are looking for positive decisions in this respect. Thank you for your attention.
Turkmen independent journalist, to be followed by delegation of Tajikistan. Anybody who registered as Turkmen independent journalist? No. Then delegation of Tajikistan to be followed by delegation of Armenia.
Thank you, moderator. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In the Republic of Tajikistan, we have laid robust legal foundations for protecting the rights of journalists and journalists themselves. In 2012, we deleted a number of provisions from the criminal code, provisions for libel and slander charges to be able to be brought, criminal charges against journalists for libel and slander. So when we do have instance of libel or slander, these are now considered administrative offences. Furthermore, we now have legislation governing the professional duties of journalists. However, when discussing the freedom of expression and media freedom, we always take journalists' rights and freedoms as our starting point. The flip side of which is, of course, their duties, their obligations. We believe that these issues need to be considered in a comprehensive manner. That's the only way that we can ensure journalist safety and provide them with fast guarantees. This is why international bodies and governments need to take a comprehensive and impartial as well as an objective approach to all of these issues. Moreover, I think there are many examples out there. Some said that Humayra Bakhtiar, in fact, she represented the European Dialogue Organization. He represented the European Dialogue Organization, and he alleged that pressure was put on him, that he was persecuted. There was no influence. There was no case against him. Because, in fact, if there were charges brought against that journalist, well, then she wouldn't have been able to come to Europe. She would have been under a travel ban. So it's not clear, because after all, she published extremist articles calling for an overthrow of the government. And she did that in order to seek refuge, seek asylum in the EU. And a lot of them do that. They use any means available to achieve their ends. So there was nothing of the sort. And in fact, their parents are alive and well, too. Her father is a teacher. He's doing very well. He's working. Also, another allegation. Apparently, the police invited her to return to Tajikistan because apparently there was a criminal case that was brought against her. Ladies and gentlemen, how naive does a policeman have to be to invite someone to come back to their country so that a case can be closed? How did they even come up with this stuff? Mr. Varki, he said that 83 journalists were killed by representatives of the president, Emomali Rakhmonov. Well, I say to him that the president was not in power when the civil war began. When did the president come to power? Well, he brought an end to the civil war. And the killings he refers to, they happened before he acceded to power. Mahmoud Ali Haid, another supposed journalist, he's still writing articles. Well, I write articles myself as well, but I'm not a journalist. If we go down that road, then Tahon Maktufi, the former special correspondent working for the Pravda, the key USSR newspaper, him and others. There was also the Islamic Renaissance Party, militants. Charges were brought against them. There were all those cases. There are many such instances. So I call on colleagues to take an objective approach, a comprehensive approach, and an impartial approach to all of these cases.
Спасибо. Armenia,
Thank you.
by Association of Tajik Youth in the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Allow me to make a couple of remarks or rather observations. While setting international norms for protection and safety of journalists and then translating them into national legislation is an absolutely required measure or step of action, at the same time we have to recognize that the real protection and the safety provision for the safety of journalists is at the local level, which means that we require also a proper and functional judicial system in our respective countries and societies. And there is an inextricable link between the norms and principles and then also the practical implementation of those principles and norms. Without independent judiciary, particularly independent courts, those norms will be continuously abused, misused, or misinterpreted. That's why I think that we need to also reflect on this link between those two and interaction between those two. And the second point is that we need also probably to cultivate the journalistic solidarity in our respective societies. And I can positively observe which is happening in my own country when a journalist is being offended or disrespect is being shown to her or to him while performing their professional activity, we immediately witness the positive reaction of the journalistic community with condemnation of that act, which in its turn serves as a restraining or a preventive measure for those who endeavored to act in an unacceptable manner from their further such kind of action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Association of Tajik Youth in the Russian Federation, to be followed by Set My People Free.
Thank you, moderator. Good afternoon to participants of this 23rd session of HDIM. My name is Sayubov, and I represent the opinions of Tajik youth studying abroad. In today's globalized world, with the technological developments, there are hundreds of technologies that facilitate the work of journalists. Many worldwide publications are training their journalists to these new realities of journalistic work. Moving from printing press to digital media give all sorts of opportunities to journalists. They can reach greater numbers of people and so on. But unfortunately, not all countries and not all media have been able to adapt to electronic means of communication. The journalists of Tajikistan, after the terrible civil war until 2010, 2015, they worked fairly successfully. They produced their reports. Now, Tajikistan today, as part of the globalized international community, is striving to develop and is now in a period of transition from printed press to digital media. Now, unfortunately, some of the journalists are losing readership and they're going bankrupt. And that is the first reason why some media are closing down in my country. Second, many journalists, because of their violations of the law, not connected with their professional work, are in fact fleeing legal liability by going to other countries, and they're taking advantage of international tribunes such as the OSCE to put their cases. Now, my recommendations pertain to the first point. Distinguished journalists, if you are a journalist, learn new technologies, take them on board, learn to earn money with honest work, adapt to contemporary realities. Insofar as the second point is concerned, I would call on the OSCE not to allow itself to be taken advantage of by criminal journalists as a cloak for their nefarious activities.
Turkmen independent journalist.
I really want to thank all of you and also the Organization of Security and Cooperation Europe for focusing on the area of freedom of expression and opinion and media. And we started with media, then we spoke about the internet, and today we focused about the importance of the protecting of journalists. And I think these days are not a waste, because I think these are very basics for democracy and freedom. And it is very basic for prosperity, because I just want you to think, if you have a deaf person and a dumb and deaf child, he will not develop, will not grow, unless you are able to communicate to him and give him the possibility to communicate with you. And this is all about freedom of expression and opinion. We want to give freedom for people to receive information and also to communicate the information. And if we want our countries to progress, we have to work on this. And the journalists play an important part on this. So I'm very thankful that you have focused on these issues in these last few days, because we want our countries to develop, we want our countries to progress, and we want innovation and creativity, and all this will not happen without these things being implemented. So thank you again for doing this, and I think continue to work at it, because without it, it will not work out. And we will kind of return back to more barbaric kind of situation. So thank you again for all the time, and my best wish is that we will continue to work on this and to see it done and implement Article 19 and protect our journalists and continue to work out to have the internet free for everybody to express, and also the media and the press. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last participant who wanted to speak is Turkmen independent journalist. The floor is yours.
I'm an independent journalist from Turkmenistan, Mr. Askleyev. Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to tell you about how Radio Liberty in Turkmenistan is spreading false information about the persecution of journalists in Turkmenistan. Journalists like Osman Harif and myself. For 7 to 20 years, depending on which one of us you take as an example, we have been working on Turkmen radio. As things stand, professional journalists in Turkmenistan working on the radio, elsewhere, in fact, there are none left. Last year, the radio decided not to work with Sultan Najilova, who had worked as a correspondent for many years. As far as I'm aware, and in fact I believe that the only reason why Radio Liberty decided not to work with these people with a proven track record, the only reason was that these people were recognized as journalists working in Turkmenistan. As things stand, the editorial policy of this radio station is incompatible with journalist ethics. It's intolerant, in fact. Intolerant towards independent opinions. Let me give you an example. When Mr. Farktusubov, the head of the Turkmen radio station in question, in fact, I called him up and told him that I wanted to start working with them again. He did not respond to my proposal. This year, the only local journalist they had working for them, Mr. Agbayev, passed away, and then I sent my proposal again, but Mr. Farktusubov once again left my request unanswered. So this happened on 3 occasions. Next, I spoke to the head of the regional bureau, Ms. Bonero. I did get a very short reply. They said that they cannot guarantee my safety. Therefore, they are postponing discussions about a potential relationship, a business relationship. I answered and said that the response I received to my proposal is a matter of principle. And therefore, I ask the head of the radio station, Madam, you, as a professional, if you're so concerned about my safety, whether I'll be safe working for your radio station, how can you guarantee the safety of your anonymous sources who are in fact providing you with false information. Falsehoods are being peddled about my country, even in the most democratic countries. Fake news are being disseminated, and in all countries, this is considered an offense. In some cases, it's an administrative offense, as a minimum. We are prepared to put forward constructive proposals. For instance, the fact that I'm here at this summit as an independent journalist. That's an excellent opportunity that we should seize. Thank you.
Well, we end the core of the discussion. We still have 8 countries which would like to exercise their right of reply. Each country gets 2 minutes so that we could finish on time today. The first in my list is a delegation of the United States of America, to be followed by the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The United States wishes to strongly refute the misguided statement that was made during the proceedings here that was asserting that the Western media cast blame falsely for the Malaysian Air Flight 17 and attributed it falsely to Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. In fact, this tragedy was thoroughly investigated by the Danish-led Joint Investigative Team, who concluded that the plane, in fact, was shot down by a Burk surface-to-air missile, Buk surface-to-air missile that was launched from Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine. These are the facts, and we wish to get them on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Netherlands, to be followed by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In response to the statement by the International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People on the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, I will limit myself to referring to the independent criminal investigation by the Joint Investigation Team that is fully in line with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2166. I also refer to the fact that Resolution 2166 obligates all states to fully cooperate with these efforts to establish accountability. The Kingdom of the Netherlands strongly condemns any attempt to discredit the professional work of the Joint Investigation Team. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. Russian Federation.
Thank you. We would like to react to something that has been said by a number of delegations, namely the United States, Canada, and Ukraine, namely to the effect that the Russian Federation is the most dangerous place in the world for journalists. I mean, this is just an attempt to draw attention away from the catastrophic situation of safety of journalists in Ukraine and also in the countries that stated this. And I would like to draw the attention of the United States to the report of Reporters Without Borders of 2018 to the effect that after Afghanistan, Syria, Mexico, Yemen, and India, the United States is number 6 when it comes now you might claim that this is fake news, that Reporters Without Borders are just Kremlin trolls. But when it comes to the liberation of individuals who have been detained on the territory of the Russian Federation, well, that exchange of prisoners, of course, was up to the authorities of the 2 countries concerned and has nothing to do with the subject of today's topic.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to use my right to reply to Croatian Journalists Association. The Ministry of Culture is committed to freedom of the media and expression, which is also protected by the Constitution of the Republic of Croatia. Republic of Croatia is signatory to various international contract and Council of Europe recommendations concerning the freedom of expression and media freedom, and is securing proper and full implementation of the existing media legislation. As a contribution to the further development of media freedoms, we emphasize that Minister of Foreign and European Affairs, on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, will sign the Declaration International Partnership of Information and Democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Tajikistan to be followed by Finland.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as a matter of principle, the statement I'm going to make will answer all of the questions which have been raised. Having said that, this session has also prompted us to draw some conclusions. There is insufficient rules governing these OSCE meetings. As a result, extremist terrorist organizations are taking part, and in fact, they're spewing vitriol and doing all sorts of other things here at this session, which of course undermines the authority of this annual meeting and their activities, especially when it comes to the protection of human rights. As for the situation in Tajikistan, we're not discussing these issues with our bona fide civil society. These are all sorts of masked, bogus organizations speaking in the room. And yesterday, in fact, they were very confused who they were representing. The freedom of expression and the rights of journalists are being upheld in Tajikistan comprehensively and in full. So everything that was said about the persecution of journalists, about the freedom of the media in Tajikistan, all of these allegations are groundless. Thank you.
Спасибо. Finland on behalf of the European Union, please, to be followed by Serbia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to pass the floor to the representative of the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In reply to the statement of the Russian Federation regarding the notion of journalist and the call for a narrow interpretation, and also following interventions from civil society during this session, we want to reiterate our position, which was made very clear also upon the adoption of the Ministerial Council decision on the safety of journalists 318 through an interpretive statement. Journalism is a function shared by a wide range of actors. We believe that protection of journalists should not be limited to those formally recognized as journalists, but should cover others, including community media workers and citizen journalists, and others who may be using new media as a means of reaching their audiences, as stated in the UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. With regard to women journalists, also in reply to the statement made by the Russian Federation, we would like to recall that we all, the participating states in the MC Decision 318, recognize the distinct risks faced by women journalists in relation to their work, including through digital technologies, and we also underline the importance to ensure their greatest possible safety. We, the participating states, also call for condemning publicly and unequivocally attacks on women journalists in relation to their work, such as sexual harassment, abuse, intimidation, threats, and violence. In our view, gender-based attacks on women journalists do remain a pressing issue, and we need to address it. Thank you.
Thank you. Serbia to be followed by Canada.
Thank you. Our delegation have already intervened this morning, but I would like to add some information on existing mechanisms used to protect and improve the safety of journalists, including female journalists, and particularly on the Working Group on Safety of Journalists, which is comprised of representatives of the Public Prosecutor's Office, Ministry of Interior, and associations of journalists. I would like to underline that the members of the working group meet regularly in order to discuss actions of state authorities in cases against journalists, and that the Public Prosecutor's Office submitted to all members of working group built-in information on performance of public prosecutors in all cases of criminal offenses committed against journalists since 2016. I would also like to draw your attention to one project developed by Association of Independent Electronic Medias and co-financed by Serbian Ministry of Culture, named Improvement of Mechanisms and Infrastructure to Combat Threats and Violence Against Journalists. These projects include the creation of online platform dedicated to the safety of journalists, legal interpretation and guidelines, free legal assistance and representation of all media workers, journalists, editors and media owners. Concerning the mentioned cases, of threats to death to Serbian journalist Tanja Wojciechowski and Albanian journalist Zana Cimili, I would like to underline that the concrete measures have been taken by relevant authorities, the perpetrators were identified, arrested, and brought to justice. These cases were also condemned by high officials of Serbia. Thank you.
Thank you. Canada to be followed by Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Firstly, let me align with the statements from the US and Netherlands regarding MH17. I would also, like my EU colleague, like to respond on the question of who is a journalist. This is a discussion we had in Milan, so our civil society colleagues are getting to see some of the negotiations we had there. We would say the same thing today that we said then. For us, journalism is what people do, not formal definitions. Very much like bias-motivated crime, we should be focusing on the targets and why these people are targets, and it's for the work they do. Limiting it to a formal definition of journalists, often decided by governments on who is and who is not a journalist, is overly and unhelpfully limiting. And as such, we, again, would reiterate, as we did in the morning session, that this should be about what they do and not who they are. Regarding the comments about women journalists, this was, again, also a serious discussion at the Milan Ministerial. And as we heard about at this morning's side event hosted by the Group of Friends on Safety of Journalists, women journalists are subject to 3 times more abuse online than male journalists. And this is not something that is replicated for actors or other fields. And so this is a clear indication for us of the intersecting discrimination that women face as journalists, that they're silenced for the fact they're journalists, and they're also attempted to be silenced for the fact that they're women. And we can't ignore that. And so for us, like my EU colleague said, this is not something that we should let pass. This is something that we should address. And we very much stand by what we agreed to in Milan to address that. And given that it has been referred to multiple times, but for those who are still unsure about this issue, we would recommend the RFOM production A Dark Place, which will give you a very clear understanding of the threats that women journalists face. Thank you.
Thank you. Azerbaijan to be followed by Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to exercise my right of reply concerning the issues raised here by the delegation and also the civil society. Some activists not involved for their political view as claimed here. They are charged on criminal codes articles, swindle, illegal business, evasion from payment of taxes, fake official documents, and other articles. All these crimes are considered serious crime according to the legislation of Azerbaijan. Taking into consideration all of this, it can be valued as a pressure on law enforcement bodies of Azerbaijan. I wonder how a delegation can define a channel pro-government or non-government. On the contrary, how the head of the channel created on YouTube in foreign country dare to disseminate threat and insult manners towards other country like Azerbaijan. Is it democracy or is it safety of journalists? About the representative of NGO raised some issues, but I would like to say some information about it. Maybe I told about it before, but I think it is necessary to repeat it. Instead of asking for finance, representative of NGO Emin Husseinov would be better if he would told about his activity in Azerbaijan. Emin Husseinov engaged in illegal business over unregistered grant contracts, evading from taxes $160,000. Though Emin Husseinov has received several investigation summons since July 2014, instead of answering them, he went into hiding at the embassy of Switzerland, wearing woman's dress in order to deceive the diplomats. In addition, I would like to know that Azerbaijani government does not have any right to annulate citizenship by the Constitution, Article 3. Thank you very much.
Delegation of Ukraine, please.
Thank you, moderator. First of all, I would like to thank the delegation of the United States of America and the representatives of the civil society for their recommendation and heeding to attention of the meeting to some problematic issues that we have in Ukraine. And I address them the way how we will be moving on was addressed in the national statement. Also, I would like to express our regret that some Ukrainian NGOs, as well one German, as they claim, were spreading fakes about my country, for example, about financing, some fascist organization or something like that. These fakes are spread by one participating state, and I feel really sorry that these NGOs, also one of them made unacceptable reference to MH17 tragedy, and here delegation of Ukraine fully aligned with the statements made by the delegations of the United States of America and the Kingdom of Netherlands. And to the two representatives of the Russian Federation, I would like to respond in Russian. Говоря о вашей стране как...
Now, when referring to your country as the worst place for journalists in the area of the OSCE, we are not turning attention to something else. No, we're saying this on the basis of facts and data, hard information prepared by the Office of the OSCE on freedom of the media. It's hard facts.
We are done with the right of reply part of our session, but I still would like to give an opportunity to our introducer, to Nani Jansen, to sum up her impressions about our discussion in a way.
Thank you, and it has been a privilege to listen to your thoughtful interventions this afternoon. Thank you for that. I just wanted to bring out a couple of common threads that I picked up in your various speeches. First, clearly an affirmation of the importance of freedom of the press and freedom of the media, and the importance to adhere to international human rights standards in respecting those rights. A broad range of topics was addressed, ranging from physical abuse to threats and intimidation. Lots of examples were given on instances also of exile and perhaps also trumped-up charges brought against the media. And the issue of the specific threats to women journalists was highlighted, both in the online and offline sphere. And I subscribe to the recommendation to look at the documentary A Dark Place, and maybe even if you still have energy this evening to come to the screening. All of these issues that were mentioned have a legal aspect to them, either because the legal system is actually used to suppress press freedom, or because there's a situation of impunity in which there are not sufficient legal consequences to actions that are taken against the media. And another thing that is important to note is that the different issues that were addressed are, of course, all connected. There were different sessions, right, throughout this week, looking at the online, physical, and now the legal threats against the media. And it's basically a continuum. And I think that the thing that stands out here is that, as several of the speakers have emphasized today, that there's a need to really operationalize the existing legal framework that is there. Reference has been made to the various international standards, Article 19 of the ICCPR, and also the various other frameworks that have been referenced in the ministerial decision of 318 of last year. I wish you all lots of courage in making sure that these standards actually get put into practice, because this, of course, is not an easy task, but it's important, and it's important to safeguard one of the most important pillars to our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nani. I don't want to give an impression that I want to prolong our session in one way or another, but just to use the opportunity of you being here, and I'm making quite a long way to come here, and also sitting in front of 57 delegations, meaning representatives of the governments, as well as plenty of representatives of civil society, I would like to put you a question which I think is quite important in the context of the discussions on legal safety here. It's about criminalization, and you mentioned criminalization of journalism as one of the threats, legal threats to safety of journalists. But you were not specific about criminalizing defamation. If you could elaborate, why do you believe, if you believe so, I hope you believe, that criminalizing defamation is a threat both to safety of journalism and also to freedom of the media? The question is very important in our context because out of 57 countries, less than a dozen have decriminalized defamation.
I have a very compact answer to that, but I will elaborate on that a little bit. The compact answer is that criminalization of defamation is simply not necessary. The type of speech that is addressed by criminal defamation laws has a place in the civil justice system. It's an exemplary situation in which you are balancing different sets of rights. So, for example, the right to privacy, right to reputation. Civil remedies are adequate to deal with that. I will actually paraphrase something that a number of the judges at the African Court on Human and People's Rights said on a case that I litigated there that dealt with the criminal defamation charges. And what they said there, and I agree with that view, is that the moment that you start looking at speech that could incite violence, that could incite hatred, etc., you can legislate specifically for those offenses. You do not need criminal defamation laws for that. And this has been a consistent view from most international institutions and international bodies. Civil remedies first, and only resort to criminal measures if it's truly needed. And for defamation type offenses, it's just not required.
And what is truly needed?
Well, truly needed. I guess then indeed you go to those extreme situations when there is situations in which people would incite hatred, incite violence, incite negative sentiments that could lead to violence to certain groups, but not for personality offenses, reputation, etc. This can really be dealt with in civil courts. And again, there, all the guidelines that have been set out about necessity, proportionality, the specificity of the laws all apply. And an important thing there to keep in mind is that even if civil measures are provided for, that proportionality aspect has to be kept into account very much, so that it doesn't lead to the imposition of excessive penalties, so excessive damage awards that could basically bankrupt a media outlet or bankrupt an individual. So.
Thank you, Nani. I hope your arguments were persuasive for the governments present here. We are almost at the end of our marathon on safety of journalism and also unprecedented 4 sessions related to freedom of the media at the HDAM. But we are not done, although we started at 8:15 with a side event of the Group of Friends on Safety of Journalists. I would like to say that this topic continues today by a side event which will start at 6:15 and organized by UK and Canada, titled "Journalism is Not a Crime, Ensuring the Legal Safety of Journalism." Very much continuation of what we have been talking about. It will be in room 1, and the office will be represented by Christine Olson, the principal advisor of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, while the representative himself will be at another event where we kindly invite the participants. It will be held in the office of the Commissioner for Human Rights at 6:30. The address is Dluga 2325. And it will be a Safety of Female Journalists online event. There will be a discussion as well as screening of a film which was co-produced by the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, A Dark Place. The title of the film was mentioned several times. Those of you who haven't seen the film are kindly encouraged to go there and also take part in the discussion, which will be started by Mr. Adam Bodnar, the Polish Commissioner for Human Rights. At both events, there will be refreshments after such a long day. That is a very important and needed thing. In the meantime, I would like to conclude the current session by thanking, first of all, our introducer, our day introducer, all those participants who have actively participated in the discussion on safety of journalists, as well as interpreters, and thank you for your interest in this topic, which is very dear to the office which I represent. Thank you very much.
I think it will be possible to speak Russian. Меня зовут Александр Шпаков.
My name is Alexander Shpakovsky. I'm the director of the Actual Concept Analytical Center from Belarus in the city of Minsk. And we are directly dealing with processes of analysis of the situation related to safety and security in Central and Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet area. And obviously, after 2014, Belarus as a state has very seriously been involved in all the possible aspects related to the so-called Ukrainian conflict, not only due to the fact that this is a neighboring country, the border of which is over 1,000 kilometers spanned, 1084 kilometers, but also starting in 2014, Belarus is the place where talks are held on the peaceful regulation of the armed local conflict in Donbass. On a given stage, our country has taken over 150,000 refugees from Ukraine. Right now, the number is diminished. Part of them returned to the fatherland. Nevertheless, the fact stays rather serious. Aside from that, we have issues in safety and security related with the fact that there's war. The southeast weapons are smuggled on the territory of Belarus. Part of our most radical citizens participating in the conflict, some on the side of official Kiev, others on the so-called side of the People's Republics, self-proclaimed republics created in Donetsk and Lugansk areas. Aside from that, we are deeply worried by the fact that the very conflict that has began in Ukraine has now become one of the catalyzers, one of the escalation points of international issues in the world. As we have noted, that after 2014, the region of Eastern Europe has unfortunately, instead of being the stability and safety zone, is becoming more militarized, and small countries such as ours are very often put before an artificial choice, either or. So either we are in a close alliance, political, military, and economic, with the Russian Federation, or we should quit this one and rather pick the way west, and in this case, our Russian and Chinese conditions will be severely impressed. The Chinese factor, which is rather a new one for the countries of Eastern Europe, but in the future it will definitely have more and more of an influence on the processes in our region. That's so much on an initial word. I'd like to present my colleagues. On the left of mine, we have my friend and work colleague Saeed Eman, who is the head of the Infoclub.by club. It is a space where authors are free to speak their mind and afterwards discuss the very same materials with the commentators, members of the club. There's indeed a discussion, informational club. Aside from that, here's a corporate of the Philosophy Institute, the Academy of Science of Belarus, and a rather well-known politologist. On my right, I have one more colleague of mine, not a Belarusian. He's a specially invited guest, as we deemed it wouldn't be correct to discuss the Ukrainian issue without Ukraine and Donbass, without the people from there. Denis Denisov, who's a political researcher from Donetsk region. His whole life he's been living in Ukraine, born in Donetsk. This is where he graduated university, but he was forced after 2015 to leave his motherland. Now he resides in Moscow, however, not losing the grasp with the Donetsk region, and we have asked him to give a couple of words on the human rights violations in Donbass, on the threats which the residents are faced in the territory found in the conflict zone, and in what the international community should pay attention to help them in this situation. Our reports, the necessity, will be available in Russian and English, so you can take them here, read them perhaps for yourselves. That would be quite interesting. And definitely, I should like now to give the floor over to my colleagues, Alexei Dermont. Then I should continue, and Denis will finish. Good day, my dear colleagues. Well, I have already been presented, therefore I consider that there is no necessity for further ones. I shall allow myself to note a certain general theoretical framework. Why is it that we decided to call a side event thus, and why for Belarus? It's very much important. The politics for the sociologist dispositioning of Belarus. On the one hand, as possibly a buffer zone between the two military, political, geopolitical blocks, either as the territory of a dialogue, a bridge between these blocks, and to what extent this or other option of choice might influence Belarus itself and the human dimension in the region as such. Has to be noted that as of today, the official authorities in Belarus have chosen the following positioning. In the area of peacekeeping, ideas where the problems are discussed in order to minimize the issues in Bus, and where the talks are held between the representatives of the non-accepted republics of Ukraine. And one could say that in this case, Belarus has taken a situational neutrality in the crisis. And since we are all very close and related to the cultural ties to Ukraine and Russia, this crisis has reflected on our society, on our citizens. It's all but obvious that our Western, Northwestern neighbors, members of the EU and NATO, these events which transpired in Ukraine have greatly influenced the situation in these countries, which in turn influence ourselves. And I should like to say a couple of words on this particular meaning, but being positive or negative. Numerous analytics have claimed that in 2013-14 it has become a point of contact which has brought to a new Cold War. And numerous persons have used this term, claiming that the thing happening right now between Russia and the West is a new option, a new variant of a return of the Cold War. But some issues say that in certain aspects the situation is worse than what we had during the Cold War. I shall give myself a couple of examples from the political practice of neighboring cities, which are Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, where processes were activated, well, mildly speaking, we could call it of ideological censorship and even political persecution against the journalists, who I think are generally connected with the worsening of the psychological situation in the region, that is the search for enemy. The fifth column, accusing the journalists of actually having supported other states, agencies, and so on and so forth. So the first example is the case of Mateusz Piskorski, political scientist,